Here folks, it's finally time to look at the Covenants, in regards to how well they assist both Catweaving and Owlweaving, and maybe start to find out which is better between the two. First up is the Necrolords, so let's get started. So we're going to split this video into 4 parts. First we will cover the signature ability, that being the neutral one, and then we will look at the Covenant ability, that being the Druid exclusive. Then Soulbinds, and finally we combine all 3 along with our previous research on conduits and legendaries to get some rough early figures. That means with the Necrolords we are looking at Fleshcraft to begin with. This is a 2-minute cooldown that after a 4-second channel gives you an absorption shield equal to 20% of your maximum health that itself lasts for 2 minutes. If you use it near a corpse, its power can increase up to 50%. Like all signatures, it's not exactly game breaking. As a healer, it's very easy to heal up 20% of your health far quicker than in 4 seconds, but it is an absorption effect, and perhaps one of its best uses is simply use it before a pull, such as, a boss or an elite, etc. How much use in a Mythic Plus? That depends on downtime, but RP does occur and those windows you could use it in. Next up is Necrotic Swarm, the Druid ability. This deals damage to the target, and after 12 seconds it will leap to an ally and heal them over 12 seconds before finally leaping to an enemy to damage them again for 12 seconds. Whilst on an enemy or an ally, it increases the power of your dots or hots by 20%. Now it has a 25-second cooldown and can be used on an ally as well. Few notes on this: it tends to prioritise enemies or allies with your dots or hots on them, as you'd hope. It does unfortunately have a travel time though. This does not consume the duration of the effect, but it does reduce its uptime, and the travel is really quite slow. You definitely want this to leap between melee as much as possible. Lastly, no target can have multiple swarms on them. If they do, they just stack up together, that being how many leaps they have left being the stacks, and they will merge up to 5. When you have multiple targets up, you'll want to use that ability on cooldown and cover 2 targets as much as you can. With a duration of roughly 36 seconds and a cooldown of 25 seconds, you should be able to have 2 going most of the time. However, if there is only 1 target, it becomes harder to manage the swarm, namely because you don't really want the stacks to overlap, all the while maintaining as higher uptime on the DPS portion, and this leads to 2 approaches. The simplest format is not to use it on cooldown and wait until it expires. This will spend 12 seconds on an enemy, 12 seconds on an ally, and then 12 seconds on an enemy before ending with a 66% uptime. The second is more complex but doesn't waste a cooldown. Here you begin as usual, cast it on an enemy, and 12 seconds later it will jump to an ally. Once it leaps away to an enemy, you then recast the swarm on an ally. When the first expires on an enemy, the second will leap to the enemy, and once this second expires from an enemy, you can cast swarm yet again, repeating the cycle, and this approach leads to a 75% uptime. Now when I said there were 2 approaches, there's actually a bonus third, that being whilst using the legendary Circle of Life and Death. In our legendary research, we found this to be the second best for dealing damage and the best for combining damage and healing benefits. And as Swarm is focused on powering up dots, this is quite a good pair. Now, Circle also affects Swarm. It reduces its duration down to 9 seconds per jump. This leads to the overall duration closer to 25-second cooldown, which means you can just make use of the sort of easy approach to do it. Now the uptime does drop with this approach, back down to 66%, but the benefits of having more dots going during its dot bonus, as well as the damage of the swarm itself, means that this is going to be a winning combination. So how much damage can we expect from the swarm? Well, on screen are the figures for a window with and without swarm. That's including our 4 dots of Moonfire, Sunfire, Rake and Rip, all whilst using Circle of Life and Death. The rest of the gear is generic template gear. As expected, Feral Affinity pulls out way ahead here. Having Rake and Rip just means that you have even more benefits from both Circle and Swarm. Overall, with all dots, balance gains about 128.5 DPS over the 27-second window, but Feral gains 164 second DPS during each cast of Swarm, and that's a 35.5 DPS increase. Now onto the Soulbinds. These will unlock as you progress through your weeks of your Covenant campaign, so we'll cover all of them and what I think are the best routes for balancing both damage and healing benefits. First up is Plagued Divisor Marilith. who's going to start off with a buff to Fleshcraft. When used near a corpse, it gains a bonus effect. Now, humanoid enemies and undead, which are some of your most common ones, won't be too much health, but dragonkins and beasts, when they are there, will provide a minor damage buff. Then we have a choice. We have a defensive Soulbind with a speed buff, a potency conduit with a self shield, or a damage buff on new targets with a finesse conduit. With more potency conduits later on, I think the best way here is put in Born of the Wilds and take the damage boost. Now this one only applies to one target for a few seconds and doesn't work too well with Sunfire, but it should help out a little. Next up is another finesse, largely doesn't really matter that much, and then another choice between a lockpick and durability on armour. Lastly, we have two potency conduits for buffing up Swarm and Fury, before finally a CC immunity while casting Fleshcraft. Second is Affinity, who starts off very nicely with a 5% health buff whenever we use Swarm and Born of the Wilds. Next up is our Swarm potency conduit, before a choice of reducing full damage or a Hearthstone, before we grab Fury of the Skies. Next up is a choice between movement speed and our third potency, haste when defeating enemies and a defensive conduit, or a fear on low on health with our second finesse conduit. No route really stands out as being that great. For dungeons, I do see the haste and defensive one being the best. For raiding, probably the third potency is what you go for. Lastly, it ends with a sort of cooldown based on ability usage that causes Fleshcraft to deal damage. Our last option is Bonesmith Hymir, while since we are not a tank, we take a cooldown to reduce Fleshcraft and 2 potency slots straight away for Swarm and Fury. Now comes the choice: self-healing and Born of the Wilds, movement speed and the third potency, or what I think is all around best, an increased crit buff and a defensive conduit. Last is a minor choice between mount speed and 3 goodies, before the unsimmable Fight as a Corpse, which is going to have some use, but it's just impossible to really work out. Overall, I'd say it's hard to know which is best. Hymir's crit buff is nice, and if you can abuse it, Affinity does look quite good in dungeons though with his haste buff. Due to Maraleth's clunkiness with some parts, I'd say the choice is probably between the last two. Not that for testing we actually have a choice because of a beta bug. So for some reason, about 70% of the routes seem to stop working once you log out and can't be fixed. Apparently we've chosen a different path when clearly we haven't. Since we don't want to test without conduits, we're going to be forced to test with Hymir, who may well be the best for drawn out fights anyway. So we're going to split the testing into 4 parts: balance and feral affinities, and also one where I was limited to 10 global cooldowns a minute to simulate when you might be spending more time healing, and then one at 30 global cooldowns a minute, which is more of a DPS focus. Now, target dummies and short times aren't the best for testing, but it's all we have, and really, it doesn't matter that much. It's a spec where DPS is a side thing, and how much time you have to do it is going to vary wildly. But let's just see how it goes. As you can see, I tested a minute sheet, and then added a simulation for what Heart of the Wild minute would look like. 10 global cooldowns a minute is pretty much limited to just Moonfire, Sunfire and Swarm, so it's no wonder that Balance Affinity comes out slightly ahead, entirely thanks to Heart of the Wild. At 30 global cooldowns though, Feral Affinity is way ahead as you'd expect. Rip and Rake, they just worked so well with Swarm and the Circle of Life and Death. It's likely only going to have to take like a Rake on a target along with Sunfire and Moonfire to have Feral pull ahead with the Necrolords. Overall, usually you'll be somewhere between these figures, so for the Necrolords I think you can safely say you'll want to go Feral Affinity. As for multiple targets, much harder to theorycraft right now. Thanks to Circle, Swarm doesn't really benefit from going on more than one target. Before you get Circle you might see a minor boost though. Multi-dotting Rake and swiping should be better I think than casting a super slow Sunfire, so in all regards if you want to go Necrolords you should take Feral Affinity and have fun Catweaving. But we will be looking at comparing Feral and Balance Affinity's AoE in a future video. Next time though, we'll be looking at a Covenant whose ability is much harder to get your head around. It's the Night Fae, one that I assume will be most popular with many druids. How will it perform though? Well, we'll find out then. Until such times though, thanks for watching.